Good afternoon, everyone. We are now in Exodus chapter 22. Do remember that Moses have gone up to Mount Sinai again towards the end of chapter 20. And last week we began a series of discourse from God to Moses to document what we call the law or the Torah. And the Torah really means instructions. Now, they were formulated into a holy nation in Exodus chapter 19. They went into Egypt as a family and they exited Egypt as a nation. God doesn't want them to do is for them not to behave like Egyptians. And so they are not to adopt Egyptian practices. Now, there were a lot of cultural practices that, whether you like it or not, when you live in a nation, a foreign nation for a long while, you kind of assimilate some of their rules and practices. And so when God waited for them at Mount Sinai and they saw God, or the presence of God in a very real way, they are now very mindful that God is setting the stage for the nation of Israel. And so what we do get right now is this. In chapter 21, 22, and 23 towards 24, there are a couple of chapters of what we would call instructions for living. Now, why do we call it instructions for living? Well, if you remember, they are a new nation. They do not have a code of law, a code where they would all live by, that they all agree to. And so you would find that if people were to sit down and invent rules, you would find nobody would actually want to listen and they would fight among each other. And so God now tells Moses, this is the rule I want to set. Now, all these rules that we are reading in chapters 21 and 22 and 23, they are rules for Israel. So we must be very mindful that these were specifically for a particular nation where the head of that nation is God. And of course, eventually with a king, but the king represents the authority of God. And they will also have a kingdom of priests where there will be priesthood to represent God and intercede for the people and to do what God wants them to do in terms of worship, in terms of interaction with God, with regards to sacrifices and so on and so forth. Now, all these needs to have a governance of rules. And so we must be absolutely mindful that these rules are not for us. And let us be careful when we approach this particular chapter. So let me actually briefly do a little chalk talk on a whiteboard here. We must look at what we call principles. The principles of why God wants them to do these things is to make sure there is peace and harmony. All right? When we talk about peace and harmony, it's peace and harmony as defined by God. And because we today, looking into the book of Exodus, we are not Israelites and we are not living in that world. We don't have an environment that governs us this particular way. And yet we are interested in whatever was said because of the principles, right? The principles are important. Why do I suggest that principles are important? Because that would be the mind of God. And the mind of God is translated into rules and statutes and governance. And without governance, there is no peace and harmony. When the rules are abandoned, when the rules are twisted, when the rules are abused, there will be no peace and there will be no harmony. And hence, when we go through these few chapters, let us be very mindful to watch the principles. Now, these are the principles that we should be mindful of ownership. And in chapter 20 of the Ten Commandments, everyone owns something. So in the eyes of God, God owns the nation of Israel. Now, if anyone comes to steal the nation of Israel, God will be very jealous. And so ownership is warned by God in the Ten Commandments. Do not covet. And so we have the coveting. And when you covet and then you act on the coveting to steal, then that would be a problem. When you covet someone else's wife, that would be committing adultery, and so on and so forth. So do not covet your neighbor's goods and their servants and the children, whatever. And all of this talks about ownership. The other thing in these few chapters, and particularly in chapter 22, you would now find the principle of restitution. The principle of restitution is timeless. When you take somebody's things, when you do some harm against another person, when you steal or rob, or you take a life, there is a need for restitution. And the restitution could be a judgment, a penalty, or a payback. And that is important. The entirety of this principle is that saying I am sorry is not good enough in many of these cases. And hence, a restitution is a principle. Restitution means you can have completion. And by completion, you have shalom, peace. And so let us now get into chapter 22. Chapter 22 begins with stealing. If a man steals, and you know the word steal here is actually to take by stealth. Let me just write that down. To take by stealth. Now, stealth means in secret. So at night you come and nobody is awake and you take whatever, an ox or a sheep. And that would mean that would be their prized possessions. In ancient China, well, an ox and a pig, right? They don't have sheep. And so if you take something that is of worth to the owner, and then what do you do with the livestock? You actually kill it, you slaughter it, or you sell it, and there is no more use of it by the original owner, then you need to restore. The word restore is shalem. Okay? Shalem. Shalem is the intensive form of shalom or shalom, right? Essentially, it means that you need to complete the payment, recompense. You need to shalem with 5 oxen for an ox, 4 sheep for a sheep. So you begin to see that there is a principle of restitution to shalem, right? To shalem, and to make complete that faulty engagement of stealing. If the thief is found breaking in and he is struck so that he dies. Now the word struck here is nakah. Nakah is to strike, to kill. No, like Cain slew Abel. That's the word, to strike. To strike and then he dies. And if that's the case, in that situation, there will be no guilt for his bloodshed. And now we need to talk about blood. You see, shedding of blood or upon the blood, it's all about blood. And this phrase is actually quite prevalent in the English phraseology as well. Blood is on your hands. You take the blood of someone else. Shedding blood is about killing. So you take a life, that's a bloodshed. And then here it says, there shall be no guilt in verse 2. And the word no guilt literally means he has nothing with regards to the blood. Right? Nothing with regards to the blood. Basically, it means no blood. The literal rendition here is no blood. And when you say no blood is in his hands in today's English, it means that he is innocent. And so this is a case where thou shalt not kill or kill with intention. It is now considered a non-guilty action of killing a thief. And that in itself is said to be in defense. Now, if the sun has risen on him, then there will be guilt for his bloodshed. And in verse 3, it means that he will have blood in his hands. There will be blood. Why? Because when the idea of sun has risen on him literally means that he has no intention of evil. And then he is struck dead. Then this person who kills will have blood in his hands. Then he should make full restitution. If he has nothing, then he shall be sold for his theft. And so this whole idea here is, if he comes and he steals, but he doesn't kill, right? He's not killed, basically. Then whatever he steals, he must shalem. That's a very clear-cut thing. If he has nothing to make restitution, then he shall be sold. And when this means sold as slave. Because you are taking somebody else's goods. Although you didn't take it away, there is a payment. If the theft is certainly found alive in his hands, so caught, right? Caught. Whether ox or donkey or sheep, he shall shalem double. So, meaning one ox or two oxen for an ox. This would mean that it is found with stolen goods. If a man causes a field or vineyard to be grazed, meaning this arson, right? Somebody accidentally lit the match and boom, the whole thing is burnt up. Lets loose his animal and feeds on another man's field, meaning I couldn't control my animal. He went into your farm and he ate your stuff. Then he shall shalem from the best of his own field or best of his own vineyard. So you notice the whole purpose of this chapter is to talk about shalem, restitution, so that there can be shalom. If the fire breaks out and catches in thorns, so that stacked grain or standing grain on the field is consumed, he who lit the fire shall shalem. So anyone who causes hurt or harm or takes somebody else's goods, whether and he must be found, obviously, whether he is found with witness or is found there and then. Verse 7. If a man delivers to his neighbor money or articles to keep, meaning for safekeeping, You could think of today's world as a safe deposit box, right? Which is something like that. Or somebody or your neighbor comes and say, can you please keep this money for me? And it is stolen out of the man's house. And so happened that night it's gone. If the thief is found, then the thief shall pay double. If the thief is not found, then the master of the house must be brought to judges. What about judges? Well, the word judges here would be this. See, in those days, we always find judges during the time of judges, obviously. Even when there are kings, there are people who are there to determine who is right and who is wrong. So the judges will then decide whether this man or the master of the house has taken the neighbor's goods. And so there must be a determination. If this guy had actually taken the neighbor's goods and said that somebody had stolen it, well, he's committed perjury and he is now the thief. And he is to restore double. For any kind of trespass. Now, verse 9, you talk about trespass. This would be pasha. And that would be rebellion. So any kind of rebellion of an ox or donkey or sheep or clothing or any kind of lost thing that anyone claims to be his, the cause of both parties shall come before the judges. Whomever the judges condemn shall pay double to his neighbor. So the word of the judge is final. And that's how one has to submit. Now, if somebody else don't submit to the judges, what do we find is that we will find that there'll be chaos. So God has appointed these kinds of people. If a man delivers his neighbor a donkey, ox, sheep, or any animal to keep, and this animal dies, is hurt, or driven away, and nobody saw it, then an oath of the Lord shall be between them both. Now, this is the serious part, which we don't practice today. Oath of the Lord, you swear before God, because in that culture, when you say, as Jehovah lives, I will do this. And I agree to tell the truth, And this idea here is that I did not take your goods. Well, the owner must accept that word of oath, because that oath is made to God, and he shall not make it good. So there is no need, because he is telling the truth before God. Now, this is probably where our modern Western court of law comes from, where somebody puts a hand on the Bible and says, I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, comes from this idea of oath. Oath to God. So you are speaking under oath to God, and if you tell a lie, God will strike you dead. And that's the understanding here. But if in fact it is stolen from him, well, you're supposed to guard it, right? But it was stolen from him, and you shall make restitution to the owner. If it is torn to pieces by a beast, then you bring that torn to pieces as evidence, because he didn't do it himself, right? Then he is absolved. Notice, we are not using all these as our way of doing things, but this is where it works in the nation of Israel, because God gave them. Our country today doesn't practice the laws of God. So if a man borrows anything from his neighbor, it becomes injured or dies, the owner was not with it, he shall surely make it good. So the man who borrows must pay. But if the owner was with it, which means that the owner was the one guiding the animal. Well, in this case, even though it's for rental, the ownership and the guardian was still with the owner. Then this man who borrows it do not have to. Because if it was hired, it came for its hire. That's the idea. if it is like I borrow a donkey, and the donkey has the owner. So it's like borrowing a car with a driver, and the driver got into an accident. So the hirer doesn't have to pay. But if the owner wasn't there, well, there will be restitution, right? He shall surely make good of it. Now it comes to more thorny grounds. When we get into verse 16, it is important for us to now be a bit careful. So let me just introduce this segment. We are fond of looking through the Bible to ask, oh, what happens when a rape occurs? Or what happens when somebody gets married? What happens when somebody gets divorced? What happens in these cases? So can we do it or can we not do it? And I am saying up front, please, please, please do not read this literally and do it, because we are not in this economy. Look at the principles. The reason we are not in this economy is because we are not living in this environment that observes the family principles, that observes the man and the woman, that observes the biblical principles of marriage, and does not observe the principles, and you can't observe the principles of divorce. And hence, that only applies when you have the entirety of the Torah of God. So you cannot take 3 parts out of the whole law of God and say, okay, we can apply here today. We can't. But look at the principles of why God said what he said, because those principles are timeless. So it says here, a man entices. And this word really means seduces. There is such a thing called seduction, right? Entice, seduce, it is to persuade. And in this case, the persuasion is incredibly tempting. And that's what entice mean. Now we have a peculiar word here called virgin. We've seen the word virgin before in other parts of the Bible, but in this particular place, the word virgin here is Betula. Betula means a young woman, a young girl who never had sex before. And by implication, this young woman is not married. So this is the culture that we have to understand. And so if a man seduces a woman who doesn't belong to another man, unmarried, because she is still a virgin, not had sex before. In the ancient times, a man and a woman, when they have sex, then they become married. And so the man and the woman will become one flesh. They leave their father and mother and are enjoined as one. And that in itself is a very visual imagery of marriage. Now, all of these doesn't apply to us today because we have different ways of looking at things, and we have civil law and we have cultural laws and stuff like that. But it is not a biblical law. We can adopt the principles, but we cannot enforce this. And so what is the question here in verse 16? If a man tries to do that to a woman who doesn't belong to a man, say who is not betrothed, basically to explain clearly that this is a virgin, a young girl who has not been married, because the idea of betrothal is to have sex. Where do we see all this? Very simply, and Isaac went into his tent and Rebekah went in and they were married, right? Jacob had sex with Leah and they were married, and worked 7 more years, and Jacob had sex with Rachel or Rachel and they were married. And so the principle of marriage is about the consummation. And then he lies with her. Notice the word lie. The word lie here is lie down. But the word lie down has a broad range of meanings. It literally means to lie down, to relax, to rest, to be horizontal on a couch, but it also carries a connotation of have sex. And thereby, the Hebrew language has a number of these, what we call euphemism for having sex. And so this man does that. He shall surely pay the bride price for her to be his wife. Now, it's important that there is an understanding of a bride price. What is this? 50 shekels of silver. You can read this in Deuteronomy chapter 22, 29. And so the bride price is basically you have gone in and violated a girl, and so you marry her and you pay the dowry. So bride price is like a dowry, and she is his as wife. Now, if the father refuses to give her to him, the father says, no, 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 no. And then he shall pay money according to the bride price of the virgins. Right? And so this whole idea is you still have to pay. Right? You still have to pay. But because the father refuses to give her as a wife, he can still demand restitution. Right? Verse 18, you shall not permit a sorceress to live. What is a sorceress? A sorceress is usually done by women, right? Women sorcerers, not to say that there are no men, right? But usually women, and they practice what we call magic, and I would call it alchemy. They are the ones who knows how to make use of pots and pans and chemistry and fire and be able to pretend to do things, see things, create potions. And God says, if you do that, the people of Israel will tend to follow all these supernatural. And so God says, she shall die. Notice there's no restitution. If a person takes this as a career, this is a career to be doomed and not in the economy of God. Whoever lies with an animal shall be surely put to death. Again, this is the word. Have sex with an animal. And this is what we call bestiality. And then it's gone, put to death. Not permit to live. Okay? These are a few things that must be very careful. If you sacrifice, the word sacrifice here means you slaughter. And by slaughter, it means you offer animals as a sacrifice to any Elohim. That's what it means, any Elohim. Remember, in Hebrew, many words are neutral. You have to look at the context to see who is it addressing. So Elohim means an idol in this case, right? An idol. Because it does not mean the creator God. And so you can only sacrifice to the Lord Jehovah. Only. And the word only means only. If you do idolatry, he shall be utterly destroyed. And that would mean, how would you say? you would be, well, I guess, to cut apart, to be divided. To be divided. Destroyed is a good word. But the idea here is you cut him apart. Because you cut apart the animal for an Elohim that is not Jehovah, this person should be cut up as well. And here you find there is a nuance, right? There are 3 verses here. Not permit to live, surely be put to death, shall be utterly destroyed. You see this? 1, 2, and 3. Saying the same thing. If you do these things, there is no restitution. God doesn't even want to talk about it. And hence you find that when you read the major prophets and the minor prophets, this is exactly, offering to idols. God doesn't want them to pay restitution because it is of no meaning. God already said. And so how can a person come back? Now, in this law, it doesn't say, right? It just say, well, he shall not live. You should put him to death. But you do realize that in the actual implementation, they don't take up the stone and stone them immediately. And they will actually judge the person. And so there is a question of dignity of life. If the sorceress, if this person who lies with an animal, if this person who sacrificed to an idol, if they repent, God will take them back. If they do not repent, then the law holds true. Now we shall continue on to the next few verses because it has to do with treatment of your neighbors, the people who live around them. Now, we don't live in this economy. This economy works if they have their own land, because God gave them a promised land. And when they live in that promised land, these are the laws that will govern them, because they will have judges that will follow to the rule, to the letter, and to the spirit, of course. When they are caught in exile, when they are distributed or divided around the world, they can only implement what can be implemented. So the law of God works when you are in that full economy of the land that God has given. And so the Torah is very much during the time when they are in the land. And so when they continued to ignore the Torah, and so God took them away. Since you don't want my Torah, you don't have the land. And that's how it works. You shall neither mistreat a stranger nor oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Watch the word here. The word stranger is ger. For you were a ger. God wants them to remember they were once like this. That they were in Egypt. They were a stranger. So now that they're going to have a land, there will be strangers who wants to live among them. And so God says, do not mistreat or oppress him. Now the first word is to treat violently. And we get the concept of Hamas here, right? The second idea is to squeeze him. And that's to persecute him, to oppress him, to give him distress. And these two are very important words. And they are not to do it to a stranger. And so one of the questions that people may ask, oh, if you can't do it to a stranger, can you do it to a fellow Israelite? Obviously not. And it is extended way out because there is a tendency when they are not your own people, your own tribe, that you can do that. And God says, no, they have dignity too. A stranger who lives among you have dignity. You are not to ill treat them. Do not behave like the Pharaoh who did not know Joseph. So the whole principle is, remember your days in Egypt. You shall not afflict any widow or fatherless child. That's an orphan. Widow means no man. Now, in those days, when you are fatherless, there is no father to defend for you. When you are a widow, you have no husband to defend for you. So, widows and orphans are two classes of people who cannot defend themselves. And so God says, you shall not afflict. And the idea of afflict is to humiliate. The idea here is if you humiliate and mishandle them or afflict them, God will come and deal with you. Why? Because since nobody can defend them and you don't defend them, God will defend them. If you afflict them in any way and they cry to me, and the word cry here would be to cry out, I will surely hear their cry, and my wrath will become so hot, I will kill you with the sword. Your wives shall be widows and your children fatherless. Basically, God says if you mistreat them, your family will be likewise treated. I guess the golden rule, do to unto others what you want others to do unto you, works very well here. And so when you get into the major prophets, like when we're doing Jeremiah now, you find that this is why God is very hot. Because they are doing all the things that God says, do not do, else I'll be very angry. Verse 25. Verse 25 is from a person-to-person relationship. If you lend money to any of my people who are poor among you, notice another class of people. When you say poor, the word here is ani. Ani is, how should we say? He is somebody who is oppressed. Well, there are a number of words we talk about this who are depressed, right? Humbled. Because they have no money, right? They are needy. And you notice this is in a same class as 1, 2, and 3. The widow, the fatherless, and the poor. And God says, take care of them. If not, God will deal with you. You shall not be like a money lender. You shall not charge him interest. What does it mean? You shall not go and press him to repay. That's a money lender. And when they repay, don't ask for interest. Why? Because you already have been blessed by God. And they are the less fortunate. And so in turn, you need to extend your blessings to them. Verse 26, if you ever take your neighbor's garment as a pledge, and this would be a tunic, the outer garment, the thicker one, as a pledge would be a guarantee. A guarantee like, no, you pay me back, I'll take this, I don't have things to give you yet. But God says you shall return it to him. What do you mean return to it? Give him back before the sun goes down. Why? Because that is his only covering. That's why he's poor. It is his garment for his skin. Else, how is he going to sleep? It will be when he cries to me, I will hear, for I am gracious. Verse 21, gracious means what? Is chanun. Chanun comes from the word chan, grace. Right? Comes from the word grace. Because when he cries out to God, God will have grace with him. God will see him in the right mind, because he has no option but to ask his fellow men for help and cry out to God, and God will deal with him. God will help him. So God says, I will hear, for I am gracious. And how will God act? Through the people. If you lend money, money means silver, to any of my people, notice, my people, the 12 tribes. This does not mean other people. Ger, you can charge interest. The Moabites come, you can charge interest. The Egyptians come, you can charge interest. The Ammonites come, you can charge interest. The Philistines come, you can charge interest. But out of the 12 tribes, God says you must protect them, the widow, the fatherless, and the poor and needy. And if you don't, God will hear them and come after you. You shall not revile God, nor curse a ruler of the people. And so if you look at verse 28, the first one says revile. The word revile is also to curse, but more importantly, it should give you the idea of make light or make despicable. Meaning, you treat God, you say things about God, you reflect badly of God. You would say that God is not God, or God is, or the idol is the God who took you out of Egypt. Things of that nature. That would be, well, in today's terms, you would say that that's blasphemous. Well, they don't have that word blasphemous. And the idea here is, when you revile God, when you get angry, when you are depressed, make sure you do not say things and change the profile of God. And the second one is to really curse, to ara. And this word curse literally means to spit at a ruler. Now, the idea of a ruler here is nasi. A nasi is one lifted up. One lifted up would be one who has a position of authority. Right? It can be a king, it can be a chief, it can be a governor, it can be something, right? Somewhat exalted, right? Exalted. And so don't spit. That's cursing, right? Tui, that would be cursing. God says, don't do that. You shall not revile God, nor curse the ruler of your people. See, it's about the people of God. It's about the people of God. Don't do that. Verse 29, you shall not delay. What is delay? The idea here is to put behind and say, later we'll do. That's putting behind. That's delaying, really. You shall not delay the first of your ripe produce. This is important. The first of your ripe produce. What does it mean? The first ones of the produce that you harvest. So when you have durians, you don't pluck the non-ripe durians, right? No, it won't drop. So you have pomegranates, you don't take the not ripe one. So when you harvest, remember to offer. And then your juices. Now this is this is interesting. This is not what it means about your juices, right? Verse 29. If you look at verse 29, let me just get you the words. These are the first fruits, and this one here, I think, how would you say? The abundance here is it appears to be juices here, but I was told that this really does not mean juice. The Hebrew word carries a different meaning, and it would be more of a heave offering. A heave offering is when you have your wheat and you take the wheat and make into bread. Then you bring it to God and you can do a wave offering with the bread of the fine flour that you made. So there is no juice that you offer to God. So I just want to make a kind of note there, right? The firstborn of your sons you shall give to me. When they left Egypt, God says, the first of your sons belongs to me. So verse 30, likewise you shall do with your oxen and your sheep. So you deal with all these important animals, but they shall be with the mother 7 days. What does it mean? This is dignity, that they need to be weaned. And then on the 8th day onwards, you can give it to me. So even the priests, you can't take a baby to be offered. You need to get the baby to wean off the mother, and the calf will be independent. Verse 31, you shall be holy men to me. Basically, it will literally mean men of holiness. Holiness means special, set apart. So God says, you will be set apart for me. And if you are set apart from me, you cannot be like any other people around you. You shall not eat meat torn by beasts in the field. Shall throw it to the dogs. What does it mean? You can give or sell to non-Israelites. They can eat it. That's fine. God only prohibits it to the Israelites. Why? Because God doesn't want them to do it. It's not properly slaughtered. It is not set apart correctly to be eaten as part of the law. And so why are we talking about all these? God's nation, God's rules. That is chapter 31, 32, and 21, 22, and 23. God is giving this nation all these rules so that there is peace and harmony. But the principles we can take away is this. Do not take things that belong to other people, whether goods or other people's wives or children. Right? Do not covet your neighbor's goods, your neighbor's wife, your neighbor's sons and daughters and manservants and maid servants and so on and so forth. It belongs to somebody else. Steal not, right? And then make sure that you deal fairly. You take care of the widow, the orphans, the poor, the needy. Take care of God's people. Do not mistreat a visitor who lives among you. So all of these is to govern for peace and harmony. And for us today, we are here to look at this, that those of us of the same faith, we need to deal with each other in a similar fashion, that God uses us to take care of one another. And so God's people needs God's rules, and God's rules require us to obey his principles. Now, these laws are, of course, very applicable in the nation of Israel. But the principles is God still wants us to take care of his people. God wants us to make restitution. If you take, you pay. You need to shalom so that the nation can have shalom. And with this, we end chapter 22.